had not said his name in 7 years. Not once. Not even in the quiet of my own mind where thoughts could bloom and wither without consequence. It was a rule I had made for myself, a piece of mental architecture designed for survival. His name was a room I had bricked up, mortared over, and pretended had never existed. But the body remembers what the mind refuses. The first thing I felt when the man in the black suit found me wasn't surprise. It was the sickening lurch of a phantom limb, an ache for a part of myself I had amputated long ago. He found me in the residence lounge at 3:17 in the morning, on the 4th consecutive night of a brutal surgical rotation. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and exhaustion. I was staring at a half-eaten protein bar as if it held the secrets to the universe. My eyes gritty with sleep I wouldn't get for another 5 hours. I didn't hear him approach. The carpet in that hospital was industrial and unforgiving, but he moved with a silence that was a quality of its own, a presence defined by its lack of sound. Dr. Thorne. His voice was low, respectful, but held a note of certainty that scraped against my nerves. I looked up. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than my car, with a face so perfectly impassive it seemed carved from stone. I recognized him instantly, not his face but his stillness. It was a trademark, a corporate signature of the world I had run from. He was the new one, the replacement for the man I used to know. The right hand, the keeper of the gate. Mr. Choi, I presumed. I can help you? My voice was flat, professional. The voice of a doctor on hour 28 of a 36-hour shift. A voice that gave nothing away. I told myself it was just a voice, not a shield. I knew even as I thought it that I was lying. He did not reply immediately. He simply looked at me, his gaze taking in the scrubs, the faint tremor in my hands from caffeine and fatigue, the determined set of my jaw. It was an assessment, cool, quick, and complete. He needs you. The words were delivered without inflection, as if stating the time or the weather. There was no need to say who he was. There was only ever one he in that world. The name I wouldn't say lodged in my throat, a shard of glass. I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum. The sound was obscenely loud in the charged quiet. No, the word was small, but it was all I had. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if he had expected it. As if my refusal was merely a procedural step. Your sister, he said, his voice still unervingly calm. She enjoys her classes at the conservatory. The scholarship has been most helpful. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, which was so much worse. It was a reminder of an invisible architecture of power and influence that had surrounded me for years without my knowledge. A safety net I had never asked for, which had just become a cage. I felt the blood drain from my face. The protein bar suddenly seemed like a relic from another life, a life I had lived only 3 minutes ago. I thought of my sister, Sarah, her bright, hopeful face, the way her fingers danced over violin strings. The scholarship had been a miracle, arriving anonymously a year after I had established my new life, my small, quiet, walled-off life. I had told myself it was a blessing from a benevolent universe. Another lie. I looked at the man, Mr. Choi. I saw the absolute certainty in his eyes. He wasn't asking. He was collecting. A debt I hadn't known I'd accrued. My autonomy, the thing I had guarded so fiercely, felt like sand slipping through my fingers. I will not be handled, I said, the words tasting like ash. I am not a piece on a board. Of course not, he replied, his expression unchanging. You are the doctor. He needs a doctor. Just that. The lie was so clean, so precise, it was almost beautiful. We both knew I was more than that. I was the one who had walked away. The one who knew the man behind the name. Or thought I had. I took a breath. The air still smelled of stale coffee, but now it was layered with something else. The scent of the past. Of a life I had sworn I would never return to. The drive was silent. The car was a black sedan with windows so tinted the city blurred into streaks of indifferent light. It moved through the streets of Seoul with an unhurried confidence, parting traffic like a ship through water. I sat in the back, my medical bag on the seat beside me. I had been allowed 5 minutes to pack it. 5 minutes to change from my scrubs into jeans and a sweater, to splash water on my face, to look at the woman in the mirror and see a stranger staring back. I counted the seconds in my head. A habit I'd developed long ago. A way to impose order on chaos. 300 seconds to dismantle one life and step back into another. Mr. Choi drove. He did not speak. The silence in the car was different from the silence in the hospital. It was heavier, denser. It had texture. It was the silence of power, of things left unsaid. We drove toward the Han River, toward the glittering spires of glass and steel that held the city's wealthiest and most dangerous. I knew the building. Of course I knew the building. I had watched it being built, a monolith of dark glass rising to pierce the clouds. He had pointed it out to me once years ago from a bridge. One day he'd said, his voice quiet against the wind, a statement of intent. I had thought it was a boast. I know now it was a promise. The penthouse was on the 80th floor. The elevator ascended in a stomach-lurching, silent rush. My ears popped. Mr. Choi stood beside me, a statue in a black suit. When the doors opened, they opened onto a space that was less an apartment and more a testament to wealth and control. Polished black marble floors, vast plains of glass showing the city sprawling below like a carpet of shattered jewels. The furniture was minimalist, expensive, and revealed nothing. It was a space designed to be unreadable. And in the center of it all, on a low white sofa that seemed to float above the floor, was him.
Kwon Yihon.
He was sitting, leaning forward, his forearms resting on his knees. He wore a white shirt that was no longer white. A dark, wet stain spread from his left side, stark against the fabric. His head was bowed, his black hair falling over his forehead. For a moment, I thought he was unconscious. Or worse, then he lifted his head. His eyes found mine across the vast, silent room. They were the same eyes. Dark, intelligent, and utterly, completely opaque. He didn't smile. He never smiled. But a flicker of something moved in their depths. Recognition. Relief. Possession. You came, he said. His voice was a rasp, strained with pain. Not a question. A statement. As if my arrival was an inevitability. A law of physics he had simply waited for the universe to obey. And in that moment, all the walls I had built, all the years of careful denial, crumbled to dust. I had not said his name in 7 years. But I heard it in my own head, a silent, traitorous whisper.
Yihon.
I crossed the marble floor, the sound of my sensible shoes a small, defiant intrusion in the cathedral of silence. My medical bag felt heavy in my hand, an anchor to the person I was supposed to be. Dr. Thorne, capable, detached, professional. I knelt beside the sofa. The scent of blood was sharp and metallic, cutting through the clean, sterile air of the penthouse. I didn't look at his face. I looked at the wound. Turn toward the light, I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of its steadiness. It was a small victory, but in that room I would take any I could get. He shifted without a word, his movements economical despite the obvious pain. The amber light from a nearby lamp fell across his torso. The fabric of his shirt was soaked through. I took a pair of shears from my bag. I am going to have to cut this off. He gave a single, sharp nod. The sound of the shears slicing through expensive cotton was loud. I worked quickly, my hands moving with the practiced efficiency of my training. I peeled the ruined fabric away from his skin. The wound was just below his ribs on the left side. A single, neat puncture. Not a gunshot. Too small. Too clean. A stab wound. Deep. I probed the edges gently with a gloved finger. He didn't flinch, but I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. His stillness was a form of control so absolute it was terrifying. There's no exit wound, I stated. The blade, or whatever it was, is likely still inside. I know, he said. His voice was a low murmur. I glanced up at his face then. He was watching my hands. Not with the fear of a patient, but with a kind of detached curiosity. As if this were happening to someone else. We need to get you to a hospital. You need a surgeon, imaging. No. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. It hung in the air between us. A wall of black iron. I am not leaving this building. I looked from his pale, sweat-sheened face to the impassive mask of Mr. Choi, who stood sentinel by the door. I understood. To take him to a hospital was to show weakness, to admit vulnerability in a world where such things were a death sentence. And to bring a hospital surgeon here was to invite a witness, a loose thread. That's why they had come for me. I was not a loose thread. I was a closed loop, a secret they were sure I would keep. Because of my sister. Because of the past. This is insane, I said, my voice low. I'm a resident. I'm not equipped for this. This is medieval. He almost smiled. It was a ghost of a thing, a twitch at the corner of his mouth that was there and gone in a heartbeat. I remembered that almost smile. It was the only currency of humor he ever dealt in. You are capable, he said. Another statement of fact. It wasn't a compliment. It was an expectation. It made my blood run cold. I told myself I was angry at his arrogance, at the impossible situation he had placed me in. But underneath the anger, a darker, more treacherous feeling stirred, a flicker of the old, familiar pull. The part of me that had always been drawn to his certainty, to the sheer gravitational force of his will. I pushed it down, burying it under a fresh layer of clinical resolve. I need supplies, I said, my tone clipped. A sterile field. Sutures, broad-spectrum antibiotics, saline, a lot of it. And something for the pain. Morphine, if you have it. Mr. Choi will get you whatever you need, Ji-hoon said, his gaze never leaving mine. It was the first time he had spoken to his man. It was an order, but it was also a dismissal. Mr. Choi bowed his head slightly and disappeared, his footsteps swallowed by the carpet in the hallway. We were alone. The city lights glittered outside the vast window, a silent, indifferent audience. The only sounds were his ragged breathing and the frantic beating of my own heart. I have to try to remove it, I said. It will hurt. I know, he replied, his eyes holding mine. 2 seconds passed. 3, 4. It was 2 seconds longer than the conversation required. It was long enough for the space between doctor and patient to dissolve, and for the space between a man and a woman who shared a history to reappear, shimmering and dangerous. I looked away first. I always looked away first. I opened my bag and began laying out my instruments on a sterile cloth I'd brought. A scalpel, forceps, gauze. I focused on the familiar shapes, the cool weight of steel in my hands. I could do this. I could be a doctor. I could fix the body and ignore the man. I could pretend I didn't remember the last time we were alone in a quiet room, the words that were said, the choice I had made. I told myself I could. The blade fragment was lodged against a rib, a piece of slim, dark metal no bigger than my thumbnail. Getting it out was a nightmare of controlled, minute movements in a space slick with blood. Ji-hoon lay on the sofa, his back propped against cushions, the amber light carving shadows on his face. He never made a sound. Not a grunt, not a hiss of pain. His control was inhuman. I worked for what felt like hours, sweat trickling down my temples. My world narrowed to the small, bloody landscape of the wound. Mr. Choi had returned with everything I'd asked for, laid out on a steel cart like a room service order from hell. A pharmacy's worth of drugs, surgical-grade equipment. The resources of his organization were terrifyingly efficient. I managed to extract the metal shard with a pair of forceps. Came free with a sickening little scrape against bone. I dropped it into a metal dish, where it clattered with a sound of finality. He'll live, I thought, with a wave of profound, unwelcome relief. Now the real work began. Cleaning the wound, irrigating it, checking for signs of internal damage I couldn't see. I gave him a heavy dose of intravenous antibiotics. The risk of infection was high. As I worked, stitching the layers of muscle and skin back together with neat, precise sutures, I felt his eyes on me. I didn't have to look up to know. It was a physical pressure, a weight on the air. I told myself it was the watchfulness of a patient. A lie. It was the watchfulness of a predator. Or a collector. Or something else I didn't have a name for. When I was finished, I dressed the wound and taped it securely. My hands were shaking, not from the work, but from the release of adrenaline. I sat back on my heels, exhausted. I had saved his life. The thought brought me no satisfaction, only a deep, sinking feeling of dread. I had just tied myself to him again, with sutures and secrets. Mr. Choi appeared at my elbow with a glass of water. I took it and drank it down in one go. The water was cold and tasted of nothing, but it felt like a lifeline. "Thank you," I murmured. He just inclined his head. I stood up, my knees cracking in protest. Ji-hoon's eyes were closed now, his face pale and slicked with a sheen of sweat. The morphine I had given him was finally pulling him under. He looked younger in sleep, almost vulnerable. Almost. "You will stay," Mr. Choi said. "It was not a question. There is a room prepared for you." I looked at the closed door he indicated. A gilded cage. "I will not be a prisoner," I said, my voice low and fierce. "You are a doctor attending to her patient," he replied smoothly. "The patient requires observation for a minimum of 72 hours. It was a perfect, plausible explanation, and a complete fiction. We both knew I wasn't leaving until Ji-hoon was fully recovered, or until his enemies found us. I didn't know which was worse. The room was as luxurious and impersonal as the rest of the penthouse. A king-sized bed with white sheets turned down, a bathroom of black marble and chrome. A walk-in closet held a few articles of clothing in my size. Simple, elegant, anonymous things. A black sweater, gray trousers, a silk blouse. The efficiency was chilling. They had prepared for my arrival. They had been certain of me. I walked to the window. It overlooked a different angle of the city, a river of headlights flowing endlessly into the dark. I was 80 floors above the world, as isolated as a sailor on a ship in the middle of a black ocean. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass. "I'm fine," I whispered to my reflection. The lie sounded flimsy even to my own ears. I didn't sleep in the bed. Couldn't. I showered, washing the scent of blood and antiseptic from my skin, and then I went back out into the main room. Ji-hoon was asleep on the sofa, a light blanket pulled over him. I didn't know who had put it there. Mr. Choi, probably, or perhaps one of the other invisible staff that kept this place running. I curled up in an armchair a few feet away, pulling my knees to my chest. I would watch him. I would be the doctor. It was the only role that made sense. The only one that kept me safe from being the woman who had once loved him. Sometime before dawn, his fever spiked. I was dozing lightly, my senses on high alert, and the first restless murmur from him brought me wide awake. I was at his side in an instant, my hand on his forehead. He was burning up. Sepsis. It was my first thought, a cold knot of fear in my gut. This was what I had been afraid of. An infection that outpaced the antibiotics. A complication I couldn't handle alone. He started to shiver, his teeth chattering despite the heat radiating from his skin. He mumbled something, his voice thick and slurred. A name. My name. Eris. It was a ghost from a past life hearing him say it. He hadn't called me Dr. Thorne. He had called me Eris. He thrashed, trying to push the blanket away. His eyes were open but unseeing, glazed with fever. I had to get his temperature down. Now, I sent Mr. Choi, who had materialized at the edge of the room like a bad omen, for ice and towels. I worked to strip his sweat-soaked shirt off, my hands moving with a desperate urgency. His skin was hot to the touch. As I pulled the shirt away, I saw it, just below his collarbone on the right side. Tattoo. It was a single, stylized character in black ink, elegant and sharp. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it was new. He hadn't had it 7 years ago. It was a mark of the man he had become in my absence. A secret written on his skin. I packed the ice towels around him, on his neck, under his arms, on his groin. Clinical, necessary actions. But my hands trembled. It was impossible to maintain a professional distance when I was this close, when the heat of his body was radiating into mine, when his delirious mumblings were filled with fragments of conversations we'd had years ago. Park. A rainy afternoon. Promise I had broken. The fever raged for 3 hours. 3 hours of me fighting to keep him tethered to the world. Mr. Choi stood in the background, a silent, grim statue. He did not offer to help. He only watched. Finally, just as the first gray light of dawn began to dilute the darkness outside, the fever broke. The shivering stopped. His breathing evened out. The sweat on his skin was cool now. He fell into a deep, natural sleep. I sank back on my heels, dizzy with exhaustion and relief. I had pulled him back from the edge. As I watched him, his face peaceful in the pale morning light, a terrible thought occurred to me. I had saved him. But what if, in doing so, I had just condemned myself? Later that morning, he woke up. His eyes were clear. The fever was gone. He looked at me, sitting in the armchair where I had kept my vigil. I must have looked like a wreck. My hair was a mess. My clothes were rumpled. I probably had dark circles under my eyes. He watched me for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. The almost smile. It held no humor this time. It held something else. Something that looked dangerously like gratitude. "You stayed," he said, his voice raspy but clear. It was not a question. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended reality. A routine of sorts began to form. I was the doctor. He was the patient. I checked his wound twice a day. It was healing cleanly, a testament to his infuriatingly resilient constitution. I administered his antibiotics, monitored his vitals, and kept meticulous notes in a small black notebook Mr. Choi had provided. I wrote in precise clinical terms. Patient is afebrile. Sutures holding. No signs of infection. It was a way to keep the truth at bay. The truth was that I was living in a glass tower with a man who was the leader of a criminal empire. The truth was that I was a prisoner, albeit a very comfortable one. Meals would appear on a low table, delivered by a silent, older woman with kind eyes who I assumed was the housekeeper, Mrs. Kim. She would set down the tray of steaming soup, rice, and artfully arranged side dishes, give me a small, encouraging nod and disappear. The food was delicious. I ate because I knew I needed to keep my strength up. Ji-hoon began to eat too, small amounts at first, then more. We often ate in silence, sitting on opposite ends of the vast living space, the city a silent backdrop to our unspoken war. I tried to call my friend Lena from the hospital. I used the landline in my room, my heart pounding. The line was dead. I tried my cell phone. No service. Of course, the entire penthouse was a Faraday cage, a bubble of isolation. My only link to the outside world was through Mr. Choi, and I knew any message I gave him would be filtered, sanitized, and used to serve their purposes. The feeling of being managed, of my life being curated by unseen hands, was a constant, low-grade humiliation. On the third day, Ji-hoon was strong enough to stand. He rose from the sofa with a slow, deliberate grace, his hand pressed to his bandaged side. He walked to the window, his bare feet silent on the marble. He stood there for a long time, looking down at the city he ruled. He was wearing a simple pair of black sweatpants and a soft gray t-shirt. The clothes hung loosely on his frame, but the power in his posture was undeniable. It was in the set of his shoulders, the stillness of his head. Rooms reorganized themselves around him. I felt my own small space in the armchair shrink, my presence diminished by his. I should have felt afraid. I was afraid, but it was a complicated fear, tangled with a reluctant and deeply unwanted admiration for his sheer, unshakable presence. He turned from the window and looked at me. "How long?" he asked. His voice was stronger now. "Until I am certain the risk of infection is gone. Another 4 days at least. If there are no complications." I kept my tone professional, my gaze steady. "For days," he repeated, as if tasting the shape of the time. He walked over to the steel cart that still held my medical supplies. He picked up the small metal dish where I had placed the blade fragment I'd extracted. He looked at it, turning it over in his fingers. It looked small and insignificant in his hand. "Do you know who did this?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. It was a mistake. It was stepping outside the lines I had drawn. His eyes lifted from the metal shard and met mine. His face was unreadable. Yes, the single word was flat and cold. It offered nothing, and yet it confirmed everything. There was an enemy. A rival. A story I was now a part of. He placed the fragment back in the dish with a delicate click. You are safe here, heiress. He used my name again. Felt different this time. Not the delirious murmur of a fever, but a deliberate, conscious choice. It was a claim. It was a warning. It was a cage forged of concern. Both of those were true. I stood up, needing to create distance. I'm going to check the dressing, I said, retreating to the safety of my role. I am your doctor. He didn't reply. He just watched me as I approached, his dark eyes following my every move. The air between us was thick with things that had not been said for 7 years. I told myself I was just doing my job, that the tremor in my hands as I unwrapped the bandage was just fatigue. I knew, even as I formed the thought, that I was a terrible liar. The silence in that room had a weight, a density. It was made of history, and I was beginning to drown in it. 6 days of silence passed. Not complete silence, of course. There were the necessary exchanges. Is there any pain? No. You should eat. I will. My voice remained clinical. His remained terse, but the space around the words grew, expanding to fill the vast penthouse. It was a silence full of observation. I watched him regain his strength. He began to move around the apartment with his natural, predatory grace, the wound seeming to be a minor inconvenience he had already mentally discarded. He would spend hours on the phone, his voice too low for me to hear, the conversations conducted entirely in Korean. During these calls, his face would become a mask of cold command. I would see the man who ran the city's underworld, the man people feared, the man I should have feared more. Then he would hang up, and the stillness would descend on him again. He would turn and his eyes would find me, and he would just watch. I told myself I was an object of curiosity. The ghost from his past unexpectedly returned. It was easier than admitting the truth of his gaze. It was not curiosity. It was assessment. It was possession. It was a question he had not yet asked. One afternoon, I found him in a part of the penthouse I hadn't seen before. A study, walled with dark wood and shelves of books. It was a more personal space than the rest of the apartment. It smelled of old paper and leather. He was standing in front of a small, meticulously cared for collection of bonsai trees. He was holding a pair of tiny shears, his large hands surprisingly delicate as he pruned a single, tiny leaf from a miniature juniper. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He didn't even look up. They require patience, he said, his voice quiet. You have to understand their nature. You cannot force them to grow, only guide them. Felt like a parable. Felt like he was talking about me. I did not reply. I just stood in the doorway, an intruder in this small, quiet world he had built. That evening, the threat arrived. It was not loud or violent. It was silent and insidious. Mr. Choi entered the living room, his face for once not entirely impassive. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. He held a long, flat box of black lacquer. He placed it on the table between us. Ji-hoon looked at it, his expression hardening. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black silk, was a single, perfect white orchid. But its stem had been snapped cleanly in two. A message, an insult, a promise of violence. I understood its meaning instinctively. Orchids were delicate, expensive, a symbol of purity and luxury. This was a message from someone who understood his world, his aesthetics. Someone who was saying, I can get to you. I can break the beautiful things you control. Ji-hoon stared at the broken flower for a full 10 seconds. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence before a storm. Then he closed the lid of the box. His movements were calm, deliberate. There was no anger in his face. There was something far colder. Certainty. Kong, he said, the name a puff of cold air. He looked at Mr. Choi. Find him. Mr. Choi bowed and took the box, disappearing as silently as he had come. Ji-hoon then turned his gaze on me. I felt pinned like a butterfly under glass. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I was no longer just a doctor. I was a witness. And in this world, witnesses were liabilities. I need to leave, I said, the words coming out in a rush. You're stable. The wound is healing. I can write instructions for your staff. He held up a hand. The gesture was small, but it stopped my words as effectively as a gag. You are not leaving, he said. It was not a debate. It was a decree. Because of this? I gestured wildly at the space where the box had been. Because of some rival gang's posturing? I will not be kept here. I will not be managed. His eyes softened, just for a fraction of a second. A change in the light, a relaxing of a microscopic muscle. It's not posturing, he said, his voice low and grave. And you are not being kept. You are being protected. The distinction felt meaningless. A cage is a cage, even if the bars are made of gold and concern. I am not your property. Kwon Ji-hoon, I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. I used his full name like a weapon. It had no effect. He just watched me, his expression unchanging. He stood up and walked toward me. I held my ground. My chin lifted in a defiance I did not feel. He stopped a foot away from me. The air crackled. I could feel the heat of his body, smell the faint, clean scent of his skin. He was so close, too close. Was it my fault, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question was so unexpected it stole the air from my lungs. Was what your fault? I asked, though I knew. The question hung between us, a ghost that had haunted me for 7 years. That you left, he said. He asked it as if it were a simple question of fact. As if he were asking about the weather. But I could see the cost. It was there in the rigid line of his jaw, the intense focus in his eyes. It was the most vulnerable thing I had ever heard him say. I had left him 7 years ago, after he had made a choice. A choice that showed me the world he was destined to inhabit, the darkness he was capable of. I had walked away without a word, without a backward glance. I had told myself it was to save myself. Now, standing in his glass tower, with his enemies sending broken flowers and his quiet possessiveness wrapping around me, I wasn't so sure. I didn't answer his question. Couldn't. Any answer I gave would be a lie, or a truth so complicated it would take another 7 years to unravel. So I said the only thing I could. I'm fine, I whispered. It was the oldest, most useless shield I had. He watched me for a long moment. His eyes searched my face, and I knew he saw everything I was trying to hide. He gave a slow, somber nod. He had his answer. My deflection was answer enough. The week that followed was a study in escalating tension. Ji-hoon was almost fully recovered, the wound a neat, healing line on his side. He no longer needed me as a doctor. My presence in the penthouse had shifted from a medical necessity to something else, something undefined and far more dangerous. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was charged with his unanswered question and my unspoken reply. He moved with a new purpose, a quiet intensity that filled the entire 80th floor. The low, urgent phone calls in Korean became more frequent. Mr. Choi was a constant, grim shadow, appearing with whispered updates, his face a mask of impenetrable loyalty. I was an observer to a war I couldn't see, a ghost in a machine of power and violence. I told myself I was still a prisoner. I told myself I would leave the moment I was given the chance. But a part of me, a deep, treacherous part, knew I was no longer fighting against the cage. I was starting to study the pattern of the bars. Then the war reached out and touched my old life. It was a Tuesday, a gray, rain-swept afternoon. The city below was a smudge of wet concrete and blurred lights. Mr. Choi brought me a phone. Not my own, but a sleek, anonymous burner phone. "This is for you," he said. The screen was lit up with an incoming call. The name on the display made my blood run cold. Lena Petrova, my friend, my colleague from the hospital, the one person who represented the life I had lost. My hand trembled as I took the phone. "Lena?" I said, my voice tight. "Eris?" "Oh, thank God." Her voice was thin and reedy with panic. "Where are you? Everyone's been so worried. The hospital said you took an emergency leave of absence. Your sister said..." "I'm fine, Lena." I cut her off the lie automatic. "I'm fine. Listen, I can't talk long. Is everything okay?" There was a pause, a shaky breath on the other end of the line. "Eris." A man came to the hospital looking for me. He asked about you, where you lived, who your friends were. He said he was an old family friend. But he wasn't. He was his eyes, Eris. They were so cold. I felt my stomach clench. Kong. It had to be. He wasn't just sending messages to Ji-hoon. He was mapping my life. He was showing Ji-hoon that his protection had holes. That he could get to the people I cared about. Who was he, Lena? What did he look like? I don't know. Just polished. He left something for you. A small box. He said you'd understand. My gaze flew across the room to Ji-hoon. He had been standing by the window, but he had turned at the sound of my voice. He was watching me, his face grim. He knew. He knew what this call meant. What's in the box, Lena? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. A bird, she sobbed. A little dead bird. A sparrow. I closed my eyes. A sparrow. Small, common, fragile. A symbol of me. My ordinary life. Broken and discarded. I'm so sorry, Lena. I said, my voice thick. Just be careful. Don't talk to strangers. Stay home. I'll call you when I can. I hung up. The silence that descended was heavier than anything that had come before. I stood there, the burner phone feeling like a block of ice in my hand. The illusion of safety had been shattered. The cage had not been for my protection. It had been to contain a target. Me. I looked at Ji-hoon. His face was carved from granite. The cold fury radiating from him was a palpable force. He walked over to me and took the phone from my hand. His fingers brushed mine, and a jolt went through me. A spark of heat in the frozen landscape of my fear. He didn't say a word. He walked to his desk, picked up his own phone, and made a call. I couldn't understand the Korean, but the tone needed no translation. It was the voice of a king sentencing a man to death. It was quiet. It was precise. It was utterly without mercy. The room seemed to shrink around him, the air growing thin. I was watching the true Kwon Ji-hoon, the man who commanded lethal obedience with a few whispered words. The man my father had warned me about. The man I had run from. And in that moment, watching him unleash the full, terrifying force of his power to protect me, I felt something shift inside me. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but it was joined by something else, a dark, terrible, and undeniable sense of belonging. This violent, dangerous man was moving the levers of his world to shield mine. He was putting himself between me and the darkness. He finished the call and placed the phone down with a quiet click. The sound was like a gavel falling. He turned and looked at me, his eyes black and deep. The fury was gone, replaced by that unnerving stillness. The storm had passed, or rather, it had been unleashed on someone else far away. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The action had spoken for him. My world, my friend, my sister. They were now under his protection. And I understood that his protection was not a gentle thing. It was a shadow that swallowed everything it covered. To be protected by Kwon Ji-hoon was to be owned by him, to have your life irrevocably tied to his. I had spent 7 years running from that fact. And now it had come for me. I had a choice to make. I could continue to fight, to demand a freedom that I now knew was an illusion. Or I could accept the terrifying, dangerous truth, that the only safe place for me was at the center of the storm, by his side. He crossed the room in 3 silent strides. He stopped in front of me, so close I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. The anger from the phone call was gone, banked like embers under a layer of ash. What remained was a quiet, consuming intensity. He didn't apologize for the danger. He didn't offer platitudes. That was not his way. He dealt in facts. The world Kong inhabits cannot touch you here, he said. His voice was low, a velvet rasp. It was a statement of absolute certainty. He was drawing a line, defining the boundaries of his power and placing me firmly inside them. I looked past him, at the rain-streaked window and the indifferent city beyond. My old life was out there. My small apartment, my grueling hospital shifts, my carefully constructed independence. It seemed very far away now, like a memory from a different person's life. The dead sparrow, Lena's terrified voice, The invisible net I now knew he had cast around my sister. I had told myself I was free. I had been living in a garden, unaware of the high walls and the watchful gardener. My autonomy had been a curated illusion. I will not be a bird in a gilded cage, I said, the words feeling weak, rehearsed. He heard the lack of conviction in my voice. His eyes softened, a barely perceptible shift. I am not caging you, Eris. I am asking you to choose the cage. The honesty of it was disarming. He was not pretending this was anything other than what it was. A life of confinement, of looking over your shoulder, of being adjacent to violence and darkness. But it was a life, he was implying, that he would share with me. This place, he said, his gaze sweeping the room before returning to my face. This life, all of it, it is mine. His voice dropped even lower, a quiet rumble that vibrated through the space between us. And it is mine if you choose it. Mine if you choose it. Not ours. Mine. It was possessive, arrogant, and yet it was also an offering. He was laying his kingdom at my feet, but making it clear that he was, and always would be, the king. He was not offering a partnership of equals. He was offering shelter. He was offering his name, his power, his shadow as a shield. And he was waiting for my answer. I thought of the 7 years of determined solitude, the careful, lonely life I had built. I had sacrificed warmth for safety, connection for independence. And it had all been a lie. Safety was not something I could build for myself, could only be given. And the price was the very independence I had prized so highly. My silence stretched. I counted the beats of my own heart. 1, 2, 3. He did not press me. He simply waited, his stillness a force of nature, like a mountain waiting for the weather to break. And in that silence, I felt the last of my resistance crumble. Not in a great crash, but in a slow, quiet surrender. A yielding. There is a moment, I know this now, when you stop falling and start choosing to fall. I was there. I was choosing. He must have seen it in my eyes. He lifted a hand, his movements slow, as if not to startle me. He reached out and gently, so gently, tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers, warm and rough, brushed against my temple. The touch was electric. It was the first time he had touched me with anything other than clinical necessity or accidental contact. This was a choice, a deliberate, tender gesture that spoke more than any words he could have said. My breath hitched. I leaned into his touch, a fractional, involuntary movement. It was all the answer he needed. A ghost of a smile, that rare, fleeting thing, touched his lips. It was not his almost smile. It was real. Small but real. He held my gaze for 3 more seconds of charged silence. Then he let his hand drop. He had made his offer. He had seen my answer. The transaction was complete. He turned and walked back to the window, leaving me standing in the middle of the room, my skin still tingling where he had touched me. The rain had stopped. The clouds were beginning to break, and a bruised gold light was spilling over the city. I knew, with a certainty that was as absolute as his own, that my life had just been irrevocably altered. I had not said yes, but I had not said no. And in his world, that was the same thing. I had chosen the cage. And for the first time, I wondered what it would be like not to rattle the bars, but to build a nest inside. The atmosphere in the penthouse changed after that. The tension of a standoff was replaced by the far more complex tension of a beginning. The air was still thick with unspoken things, but now they felt like promises instead of threats. I was no longer a patient. I was no longer a prisoner. I was a resident, in every sense of the word. The next morning, Mrs. Kim, the quiet housekeeper, brought my breakfast tray. But this time there were 2 place settings. She set it on the large dining table, not the low coffee table, and gave me a genuine, warm smile. "He is in the study," she said, her first words to me. "He is waiting." I walked to the study, my heart a quiet, steady drum against my ribs. He was there, standing by the bonsai trees, the morning light filtering through the window. He turned as I entered. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers. The patient was gone. The man remained. Good morning, Eris, he said. Felt normal. Terrifyingly, beautifully normal. Good morning.
Yihon.
I said his name. Deliberately. Not as a weapon, not as a memory, but as a simple fact. His name in my mouth, in this quiet room. It landed between us with the weight of a treaty being signed. He stilled. I saw him swallow, a tiny movement in his throat. He had waited 7 years to hear me say it like that. Say it again, he said, his voice a low command.
Yihon.
This time I met his eyes as I said it. Acknowledgement. Acceptance. A choice made solid. He walked towards me, closing the space between us until he stood directly in front of me. He reached up, not to my hair this time, but to my face. He cupped my jaw in his hand, his thumb stroking gently along my cheekbone. His touch was warm, possessive, and exquisitely gentle. I did not pull away. I closed my eyes. He leaned in, and I thought he was going to kiss me. I held my breath, but he didn't. He rested his forehead against mine. We stood like that for a long moment, just breathing the same air. The scent of his skin, clean and masculine, filled my senses. I could feel the faint tremor in his hand. The man of absolute control was trembling. He was as vulnerable in this moment as I was. That was his gift to me. Not his kingdom, but his vulnerability. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine. He unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his shirt. He took my hand and placed it on his chest, just below his collarbone. My fingers brushed against the tattoo I had seen when he was feverish. The stark, black character. What does it mean? I whispered. He covered my hand with his own, pressing it against his skin. I could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath my palm. It means balance, he said. A reminder that for everything gained, something is lost. That power requires sacrifice. That to protect something, you must be willing to destroy something else. He had gotten it after his father died. After he had taken his place. After I had left. It was a scar he had chosen. A philosophy etched into his skin. He was showing me the core of the man he had become. The man I had to accept if I were to choose this life. I traced the sharp lines of the ink with my fingertip. It was a part of him. A part of the darkness he inhabited. And I was no longer afraid of it. Later that day, a woman came to the penthouse. She was tall, impossibly elegant, dressed in a Chanel suit the color of cream. Her name was Sujin, and she was introduced to me by Mr. Choi simply as a colleague. She was, I gathered, the public face of his legitimate businesses. She had a smile that was both warm and sharp, and eyes that saw everything. She and Ji-hoon spoke for an hour in his study. When she left, she paused by where I was sitting, pretending to read a book. He is not an easy man, she said, her voice a low, melodious murmur. He builds walls of silence. But you should know. The quietest rooms are the ones he values the most. She gave me a knowing look, a flicker of female solidarity across the chasm of our different lives. He has not had a quiet room in a very long time. With that cryptic piece of advice, she was gone. A quiet room. I looked around the vast, silent penthouse. It was no longer a cage. It was becoming something else. A sanctuary. A fortress.